maybe these 2 weeks of class, we have studied transitivity, right? And let me do a recap. Let me do a quick summary of transitivity. So transitivity has to do with grammatical patterns, right? So when we want to describe things, when we want to describe events in the world, we have maybe 6 different ways to do it, right? When we want to describe what we see, what we do, what we think, how two things are related, there are maybe 6 ways to arrange the information, right? To organize the information. And 6 ways to organize the information are like this. This is from last week, okay? So we have the material process, we have the verbal process, mental, behavioral, relational, and existential process, right? And these are different ways to organize information about our experience in the world, right? And the material process has to do with the process of doing or happening, right? So who does what or what happens, right? The process of verbal is to talk about how we say things, right? Mental, how we think, behavioral, how we exhibit our physiological movement. Relational, how two things are related, and existential, why things exist and how things exist. So there are 6 different ways of organizing information, okay? Now today, last time we didn't finish the example, right, from the handout. So let's go over that example from last time. And I asked you to read that at home, right? So it should look like this. So we'll look at news piece number 2, where you see prison officers fear that Muslim inmates are turning to extremism, okay? So focus on that today. So does anyone need a copy of the handout from last time? The reactions that different people, different prison officers, so people who take care of the prison, right? Different reactions that they have towards Muslim inmates. So inmates are people who are put in jail, right? And so on. So we'll look at how processes are used in this piece. And there are 4 main participants, right? We have the prison officers, prison authorities, Muslim inmates, and other inmates. So let's see how they are represented in this piece. So if you look at the headline, prison officers fear that Muslim inmates are turning to extremism. So what do you see here? Fear. What kind of process is it? Mental, right? So it's mental. So you write down mental and under prison officers, right? Because they fear. So you see one mental, and you see Muslim inmates turning to. So turning to is material, right? Material. So if it's the process of doing or happening, if it's doing or happening, something happens or someone does something, so that's going to be the material process. So you have, in this case, you have the material process for prison officers and the material process for, mental process for prison officers and material process for Muslim inmates, okay? And then in the first paragraph, right, in the first paragraph, staff at a top security jail fear Muslim inmates are pressurizing other Muslim prisoners to adopt extremist views. So what do you see? Staff, that's prison officers, right? So staff fear. What process is that? Mental process again. So you have mental, right, for prison officer. So you have 2 now, right? And then Muslim inmates are pressurizing, put pressure on, right? So this is the process of doing, right? So it's material, and this is for Muslim inmates, right? So you have 2 materials for Muslim inmates and 2 mental for prison officers. And what else? Encouraging other offenders in the same paragraph, in the second line or so, encouraging other offenders to convert to Islam. So encouraging, so that's the process of doing, right? So it's the material process for Muslim inmates again. So you have 3 material processes for Muslim inmates, okay? The way I do this is I use different colors to mark different participants. So that's how I do it, so that I can keep track of things. Number 2, in paragraph 2, you have prison officers at Whitemore Jail also fear growing radicalization. So fear, that's mental again, right, for prison officers. So you have 3 mental processes for prison officers. And in paragraph 3, what do we have? On one wing at the jail staff, staff admitted that Muslim inmates policed themselves. So you have verbal, right? Admit is verbal. That's for prisoners, right? That's for prison officers. And then police themselves, that's the process of doing, so that's the material process for Muslim inmates. In paragraph 4, one inmate claimed to inspectors that inmates are converting to Islam because blah, blah, blah. In this paragraph, one inmate here is not Muslim inmate, right? But it's other inmates. So that's the verbal process, okay? And Muslim gangs in the jail provided it. Muslim gang here is refers to Muslim prisoners. And then that's the material process, right? Provide it, that's the material process. Now, don't you see that when they mention Muslim or Islamic people, they have to have the adjective like Islam or Muslim all the way. But when it's other inmates, they don't have any adjective. So I think that's kind of a discriminating way to refer to people. I mean, some people don't like it to be called like Asian or Korean or female all the time, right? And when it's like, if it's a doctor, you would assume that it's a male doctor. But when it's a female doctor, you have to have that adjective female all the time, right? And it's a kind of a way to discriminate people. Why can't we think of doctor as being both male and female at the same time and so on? So this is kind of the same idea, okay? Now, in number 5, and owners, the chief inspector of prisons urges the prison service to do more to provide staff throughout the jail system. So, and owners, that's the prison authorities, right? So you have urges, that's the verbal process, right? Urge is a verb of saying, so it's a verbal process, okay? In paragraph 6, the number of Muslim prisoners, not just normal prisoners, just has to be Muslim. Muslim prisoners in jails double in 10 years. So double is material, right? It's a process of doing or happening. So double is happening. So this is a material process for Muslim prisoners, okay? So we're done with paragraph 6. Paragraph 7, we have misowners said the top security prisons are facing increased risk. Again, this is prison authorities, so we have the verbal process, said, okay? Number 8, she said, same thing, verbal process for prison authorities. Number 9, a committee had been created to advise on action to deal with possible gang prison authorities. And in this case, you see the material process in the passive voice, right? Created, that's the process of doing. This is an example of, if you remember, abstraction, right? Abstraction. So a committee has been created to advise on what actually is being done here. I know that the committee is created to give advice, but what kind of advice is being given here? We are not told, but we are just told that something has been done, right? And there's a committee for it, but we don't know the role of the committee and what exactly the committee is doing. So in this case, it's an example of abstraction in the material process. Okay? Number 10, despite the strong central systems, residential staff, in other words, prison officers, were mostly unaware of the initiatives. They expressed a fear of what they saw as a rising problem. So what do we have here? We have were mostly unaware, right? Were mostly unaware. So we are at paragraph 10. Were mostly unaware. That's the relational process, right? Were plus this kind of adjective, maybe. Mostly unaware. And then fear, express a fear. So that's the verbal process. And then, actually no, express a fear. That could be mental, right? That could be mental. So mental process and what they saw, that's also a mental process for prison officers. So up to this point, what do you see as being the predominant process of the prison officers? How many instances of mental processes do we have? A lot, right, for prison officers. So up to this point, we only see the mental picture. We only know, we are persuaded by the writer to know, to look into his brain, to look into their feelings of fear and doubt and so on, right? So up to now. In number 11, in paragraph 11, staff were unsure about how to treat Muslim inmates. So unsure, that's relational process. We have the be verb and then the adjective unsure. And continuing from there, the report said officers were reluctant. Again, relational process, the be verb plus reluctant, which is an adjective, right? And then we have deliberately kept their distance from them. So that one is material for prisoners, prison officers. And we have they fear, again, mental process. Okay? So it seems that up to this point, up to this, the end of the first page here, we see a lot of mental processes being given to prison officers and also relational processes, right? So two main processes for prison officers. And for Muslim inmates, the processes are material processes, most of them, okay? In number 12, some staff appear reluctant to engage. Again, appear reluctant, that's the relational, right? We have kind of the relationship between the staff and how they feel. So that's the relational process. Appears like the be verb, linking verb plus the adjective there, to engage with Muslim prisoners and little information and training they had received about Muslim prisoners. So that one is like material process, okay? So we're done with number 12. And then, which inevitably, unavoidably impinge acting on the way. So that's the material process for the staff, okay? Prison staff. Number 13, it added, prisoners said that staff attitudes toward them changed remarkably for the worse if they choose to or happen to associate with the prisoners. So there is the added, which is the verbal process, okay? And then prisoner said, that's another verbal process. Number 14, there was a perception among officers that some Muslim prisoners operated as a gang. That's existential, right? So we have one existential right here. And that's the same for number 15, paragraph 15. There was a reluctance. That's the existential process again, right? And in that paragraph 15, an officer on one wing said that. That's the verbal process for staff officers. And the staff group agreed, in number 15, agreed at the very end. So that's the mental process. Okay. Number 16, paragraph 16, describing the gang culture at the jail, one inmate said, this inmate is not Muslim because there's no adjective that indicates otherwise, right? So in this case, it's the verbal process for other inmates. Staff are worried as they will do, as to what they will do. So worried, this is for prison officers. Staff are worried, that's the relational process, okay? They're beginning to outnumber everyone and don't care. They referring to Muslim inmates, right? So in this case, we have material process, outnumber is the process of happening, and don't care, they don't care. Muslim prisoners don't care, so that's another material process. In 16. In 17, we have the said as the verbal, right, and relational. The new gang are the Muslims, that's the relational process. And then in 18, 19, and 20, you have a lot of verbal processes, okay, from prison authorities. Okay, So and 20 and 21, you have a relational process, but that doesn't have to do with the participants. Okay? They are talking about the more sophisticated approach that is now in place and so on. So we don't need to focus on that. So we focus on four groups in particular, right? So again, up to this point, what do you see as being the predominant process for prison officers? Again, we see material processes, right? A lot of material processes for, a lot of mental processes for prison officers. Okay? So I can say for prison officers, this is a good way, right? So that I don't have to like go to the two boards. Officers, we have a lot of mental processes, right? And we also have a lot of relational processes. And maybe some verbal processes. Okay? And for Muslim inmates, we have a lot of material processes, right? And maybe one mental process and one relational process. Okay? And for prison officers, prison authorities, we see a lot of verbal processes. Okay? And for other inmates, we have a lot of verbal processes. So that seems to be the picture of what we got from the reading, right? Now, the next thing is our interpretation. So how should we interpret this kind of different ways to represent different groups? So we have four groups here. You see that prison officers, they are attributed a lot of mental processes. And these processes have to do with fearing, right? Or being afraid. So remember last time we talked about whether a participant is activated or passivated, right? Are they represented as doing something, causing some damage, causing some harm to other people, or are they represented as passivated actors, right? So in this case, we have a lot of mental processes. That points to the fact that prison officers are passivated actors, right? So we can say that prison officers are passivated. They don't act, and they remain in their appropriate role, right, as prison officers, right? And they just stay in their role, doing the things that they should do. Whereas if you compare their roles, like being afraid, to Muslim inmates, they are attributed a lot of material processes, meaning that they cause things to happen, right? So they act upon other people, including prison officers, right? They act upon other people because they are attributed a lot of material processes, right? And acting with the goal or without the goal, like pressurizing people with goals, right? Pressurizing people or converting people, doing something to other people so that they cause fear, the mental processes, to the officers, right, and other inmates. And also, if they don't act on any goal, they double, their number double, right? Their number doubled in the last 2 years, for example. So with or without the goal. With or without a goal. Okay? Goal meaning other people or including prison officers or other inmates. Okay? So they are activated. And they produce reaction from other people. And those reactions are not good. Those reactions are reactions of fear, right? And for prison authorities, we have a lot of verbal processes, right? What does that mean? That means that people whose voices are being represented, they are important people, right? We need to hear from these guys, right? These guys are authorities in the prison, so we need to hear that something has been done. So when the reporter presents the news to you, so they include the voices of authorities, right? So that you know that something is actually being done, right? To take care of, quote unquote, problematic people, right? And, but are we told as to exactly what is being done? No, right? Because we have a lot of abstract actions going on. As in line number 8, as in paragraph 9, a committee had been created to advise on. We know that there's a committee, but what does it mean to advise on? Just to give advice, what advice are they giving, and so on, right? So we are not told as to what exactly is being done, okay? And in paragraph 19, if you look at paragraph 19, again, from one of the prison authorities, Phil Wheatley, Director General of National Offender Management, in that paragraph, okay? It's also important to recognize the action being taken to manage challenging prisoner profiles. What actually, what does recognize actually mean here? To recognize the action being taken. What action is being taken, and what does it mean to recognize the action? How do we do it? So whatever they say, they are represented using a lot of verbal processes, but what exactly they say is in abstract, right? It's in abstraction that we don't actually know what's going on. But we are told that they say a lot of things, but actually when we look at what they say, it's just abstraction, okay? So that's for prison authorities. And other inmates, we hear their voice because they are not Muslim prisoners, right? So we have to hear their voice, and we have to think about we have to think about how they represent the Muslim inmates, right? So their voices are full of fear and full of hatred and so on, right? So in this case, again, we can say that by using different ways of positioning people, representing people, the prison officers are like good guys. They do their job, and they just have fear. The fear was caused by Muslim inmates who are actually doing things to people. And then we have heard from prison authorities that actually actions have been taken, but we don't know, they are unknown, right? We don't know what actions are being taken. And we hear about other inmates too, but whatever they say, they just express fear and hatred to other Muslim prisoners and so on, right? So you can see that people can manipulate, people can control how they want to represent different groups of people using different grammatical patterns, right? Things could be the other way around, okay? So that's another example to see that mental processes are so important because they could let you into someone's head without actually you having the access to it. Okay? Now, what we'll do today, there's one more example on that handout. I will have you do it over the weekend, and we'll come back on Monday to look at it. What we'll do today is to continue with transitivity. Today, we'll continue with hard cases. So today will be hard cases. So you know how to analyze transitivity in basic sentence patterns, okay? In basic sentence pattern. But today we'll do hard cases. So cases that are so hard to analyze. So when we look at, again, transitivity is choosing from different patterns, right? Now, if you look at the first example, this is from the handout, from the PowerPoint for today, Krista saw something wonderful. This one is easy to recognize, right? We have Krista as the sensor. This is the sensor or experiencer. This is the mental process, right? Saw is the mental process. So Krista saw something wonderful. So that's the mental process with Krista as the sensor or experiencer and so on, right? Something is that thing which is experienced. That's easy. But now that pattern, that event can be described using other grammatical patterns. Krista came upon a wonderful sight, and a wonderful sight met Krista's eye. These two examples, as you can see, they are represented maybe using different processes. came upon is no longer a mental process, right? And then a wonderful sight, this should be an H, a wonderful sight met Krista's eyes. Again, in this case, it's not a mental process. It's actually a material process, right? The process of happening. So you can do that. You can see that transitivity is just selecting what you think is the most appropriate sentence structure that you want to use in order to describe the same event. So transitivity is a system of selection, right? Now we're going to look at cases like 2 and 3, and these are hard cases because we say that 2 and 3 come from number 1. Okay, they have their baseline. They have that base in number 1. Okay. In a similar way, if you look at number should be 1 and 2 here. I don't know why the numbers do not run consecutively. If you look at these 2 more examples, the driver drove the bus too rapidly, so the brake failed. Okay, failed to operate. Okay, the driver drove the bus too rapidly, so the brake failed. We have 2 clauses here, right? The first clause we have the material process. The driver is the agent. Drove is the material process. In the second clause, we have the brake as the agent, and fail is the material process. But if you change that to this, this sentence, the driver's rapid driving of the bus caused brake failure. In this case, it's still the material process, but the agent is no longer the driver, right? In the first one, the agent is the driver for sure. But the second one, we have the driver's rapid driving of the bus. Where's the head noun here? The head noun is driving, right? Driving caused, rapid driving caused brake failure. The agent here is no longer the driver, but it's the rapid driving, right? And then the goal here is the bus, right? In the first one, drove the bus is the goal. Whereas in the second one here, the goal is failure, to cause failure. Now, you can see that why I call it a hard case, because the agent is not a typical agent that you would think, right? An agent is usually a person or a doer who does something. But in the second version here, the agent is no longer a person, like rapid driving. And how could it act on brake failure, right? So, and then the goal here is not a person or even a thing. So that's why I call it a hard case, because it's still a material process, but the agent is not the typical agent, or the goal is not a typical goal that we are used to seeing, okay? So we'll look at cases like this. Now, I want to bring up these 2 terms, congruent and incongruent structures, okay? Typically, when we want to describe an event, okay? When we want to describe an event, typically we use verbal groups for processes, right? So we have different processes. Processes are like steps of things, right? We could do the material process, the verbal process, mental process, and so on. And we use verbal groups. We use verbs to represent processes, okay? That's normal. That's typical. And we use nominal groups like noun-like groups to represent participants, right? Different participants like agent, experiencer, right? Verbiage, sayer, and so on, right? Existent, and so on, remember? So that's what we did. I could bring you this slide. So you see, we use verbal things to represent different material, to represent different processes, and we use noun groups to represent different participants, whether they are agents, they are sayer, they are sensor, they are behavior, and so on, right? We use noun groups to do that. And that's typical. And we use adverbial groups like prepositional phrases or adverbs to represent circumstances, right? On Monday, for example, in the field, we use prepositional phrases, we use adverbial groups to represent circumstances, extra information. That's typical, right? This is what we call a congruent sequence of grammatical representation because it's typical. So we call it congruent. Congruent meaning compatible, okay? Going together, typical, okay? However, that's not the only way to represent an event, right? Sometimes the grammar that we use may depart from this typical pattern of verbal representing processes, nouns representing participants, and adverb groups representing circumstances. Sometimes the pattern might depart from that pattern. So we call this kind of representation incongruent. Incongruent meaning incompatible. Incompatible representation. Okay? Now, incongruent patterns affect the transitivity structure of the clause, right? Because sometimes the agent might not be the agent that you would expect as a person. It could be some noun group like rapid driving of the bus, for example. And sometimes the material process or the mental process might change to material process, whatever, right? So it will affect the transitivity pattern for sure if you use incongruent patterns. And the general movement has been from abstract to concrete. So people want to turn some abstract things into more concrete things, and along this line. So when you have the relation process, sometimes people want to turn relational processes into material processes, because material processes are very concrete processes and so on. Okay? I'll show you examples like here. So congruent patterns. Okay? They began installing the machine last year. That's very typical, right? They, agent, people doing things, right? Began, like material process, began installing the machine. Material process of doing. Last year, that's the adverbial, right? So representing the circumstance, right? That's typical. Now, the same thing could be said using a different pattern. So you have their installation began last year, right? Their installation here has become, I don't know how to call it, carrier, existent, or even the goal or the agent began relational, existential. What process is that? And then last year still the circumstance. The reason why it's difficult because this is not the kind of the agent that we are used to. So that's why I have difficulty categorizing it. Because how could you say that their installation is the agent? Because we think of agent as having some kind of volition, agent having some kind of power to do that. But how could the installation just start it by itself, right? It cannot. So in that case, being an agent is not what we usually think of as an agent. So that's why I say that it's an incongruent pattern. But still, it's grammatically correct, and it still describes the same event. Okay? Another example is this one, where you have, in almost every store in Seoul, cell phones are sold. That's typical, right? We have the circumstances here being represented in the prepositional phrase. In is the preposition. Cell phones are the goal in the passive voice, and then this is the material process of doing. But you can say almost every store in Seoul sells cell phones. In this case, from the circumstance here, you have the actor or the agent. But it's not the typical agent that we think of, because unless you think of store as representing sellers, right? Store itself doesn't have any kind of power, right, to sell, unless we are talking about people in the store, right? And then cell phone, as actually the store is doing something, but actually it doesn't. It's the people in there, right? But this is a different way of representing the same thing, though. For the last page, that might be too detailed. So what I'll do is I will give out this handout and have you look at examples, more examples of congruent and incongruent patterns. Okay? So we'll work from that handout. And I think that this topic is important because the reason why English might be too difficult for some of you at least is that we see a lot of incongruent patterns, right? And incongruent patterns are what we don't expect, and yet it's something that people use a lot in writing, even though not in speaking. So incongruent patterns are hard to understand because we don't expect them. Okay? So I can bring this slide here. You see, now we'll compare different patterns. The congruent pattern is what we expect, and incongruent patterns are patterns that we don't expect, but they are still correct. So process realizes entity, right? Now the process is turned into an entity, meaning a thing or an agent. So when you can say breathe deeply, right? You can tell someone, breathe deeply, please, right? So breathe is like the behavioral process, right? Now breathe is the process, which is a verb. A verb is a process normally, right? But now you can say take a deep breath. Now breath is no longer a process, right? It's no longer breathe here, but it's a thing. Take what? Take a thing, right? So take is a material process. Take a deep breath, for example. So now you have a material process and, I don't know, a goal, right? A deep breath, maybe a goal, right? Because it's a material process. Or X bursts out laughing suddenly, right? In this case, you have burst out laughing, which is a verb, a process, right? And, but here, you turn it into an existential process with dare. And then sudden burst out of laughter, that's the existent. So you can see that, from a verb, you have a noun, okay, from a verb. Or X continued to explore the world, whoever X is, okay? Columbus continued to explore the world. And now you change it into the exploration of the world goes on. So it's like an agent, something that goes on, right? Or X's exploration of the world goes on. You have the X as the agent here. But the whole noun phrase still is the agent. So instead of X being the agent, the process here is turned into an agent. So that's why I call these incongruent patterns harmless, right? Because they are so not typical, and yet not typical in terms of our expectation, and yet they are typical enough to be seen on pages. In number 2, attribute realized as entity, meaning like adjectives or adverbs that you would think you would see in relational processes. X is good, X is bad, for example. In relational processes, these attributes are turned into entity, meaning turned into agent or turned into participant. If firms are big, there will be fewer and will have less need to compete. Now you can turn it into bigness gives rise to fewness and a decline in competition. So you can see that bigness here gives rise to material process, right? Bigness is like an agent. Entity is like an agent, right? Entity means like a thing or a person. So bigness here is represented as a person who can do something, who can give rise to something, right? Which is not typical of what we usually think of. Okay. This machine is becoming less useful. This is like a relational process, and this is the attribute, right? And we have the usefulness of this machine decreases. It's like this can decrease by itself, which may not be true in reality if we think about it, right? So this is an incongruent pattern of things that you might find when you analyze transitivity. Okay? In the third one, we have circumstance as entity, meaning things that used to be prepositional phrases, adverbial phrases, they are turned into people or thing or participants. The travelers arrived in Rome on August 12th. Now, on August 12th, that's circumstance, right? Just extra information in the prepositional phrase, right? Construction. But in the A version, in another version, incongruent pattern, you have August 12th, found the travelers in Rome, for example. In this case, it's like, I don't know, agent, right? August 12th, a day can be an agent, can be a thing that can find people, which is a weird way of representing things, right? But still, people use it. During the last decade, agricultural technology has increased as never before. Again, this is a circumstance, right? Now, you have the last decade had witness. It's like this is a person that can see, right? When in fact, it's not a person, right? But the grammatical pattern says that it is, right? It's an agent, a material in the mental process, right? Witness is like mental process. In the 17th century, scientific works began to be published, whereas you can write it as the 17th century saw the publication of scientific works. In this case, it's like, again, a sensor or experiencer that can have the mental process there, which is a different way. But isn't it this kind of thing that you would find difficult in English, that you don't you don't have the congruent patterns. You don't have patterns that you expect. But when people write or when people express themselves in more complicated situations, they would use this kind of pattern, right? Incongruent patterns in writing that might make it hard for you to interpret, right? English. And then in the last one, we have circumstance-dependent clause. We have a circumstance that's in the form of a dependent clause or subordinate clause that's turned into a thing or a person. Like because people fear that oil would not be supplied as usual from the Gulf, the price of crude oil rose dramatically. So in here, from here, you could change it to fears of disruption to oil supplies from the Gulf help push crude oil prices up dramatically. So it's like fears could help you, could help to do something, which is an agent, right? Agent of the material process push. But in fact, how could fear do that? It's actually people who are doing that, right? But fears here is being represented as people, as entity, as people, right? As agent in the material process. So isn't it this kind of pattern that we find hard to understand in English, right? Especially for beginners who just start learning English, right? They would expect this kind of pattern, right? The subject being a person, the verb, and extra information in the adverbial or prepositional phrases, and so on, right? And whereas this kind of thing requires you to do some kind of linguistic work. So you have to change the clause into like a noun here, like long noun phrase with a verb here, and so on, right? So that's the kind of thing that you should be able to do and you should be able to understand too, right? And these are hard cases to analyze because how would we analyze fear as agent, right? It's not something that we usually think of fear as, right? So what I'll do next is to practice for today. We'll practice changing back from incongruent patterns to congruent patterns. So in other words, if you see a sentence like this, can you change it into a more typical type of pattern? In other words, can you unpack the meaning of this? Okay. So some of you have this handout already. It's the same handout if you have 2 pages. But if you have only 1 page, I'll give you this other page. So in the first one, for example, you have new regions, right, are reaping the benefits of improved agricultural practices. So in this one, you have a circumstantial subject, which is not what you would expect, right? You would expect kind of the circumstance to be in a prepositional phrase or in an adverbial phrase, right? So new regions are reaping, just like new regions are doing it, right? Are reaping, getting the benefits of improved agricultural practices. So this is incongruent because we usually think of circumstances being in prepositional phrases or adverbial phrases and so on, right? So how would we change it back into the more congruent one? So can you use a prepositional phrase that would change the new region here into a more typical circumstance, like in new regions? Can you do that? How could we make a meaningful sentence out of this? In new regions, who might be reaping the benefits? People, farmers, who know? So we can just say people. Oops. People are reaping the benefits of improved agricultural practices, like that, right? Or you could use the passive voice version, like the benefits of improved agricultural practices are being reaped, and so on. Okay? This is a more typical pattern that you would expect, okay? Because the circumstance will be in the prepositional phrase, right? Rather than being an agent that can do things like new regions are reaping, right? Like number 2, how could our own era, our own time partakes of, right? How could it do that action, partake of, is a material process, right? And it means to share or to take part in. Partake is to take part in. The Victorians' passion for restoration. So how could an era, how could a period of time do that by itself? No, right? So it's incongruent. So we want to change it back to congruent, more congruent pattern. So as an example, I can do something like, in our own era, people partake of the Victorians' passion for restoration. You can do that. Right? And so on. So for other examples, can you do them by yourself? Like process as participant. Now in number 3, we have American insistence on this exception invites other nations. Like how could insistence invite something, right? Insistence is just a noun. It's abstract noun. How could it invite, right? So we have to find an actor or we have to find other participants that are more typical rather than insistence, right? So who insists on? So we have to start with that, right? Who insists on, right? We have American insistence, so who insists in this case? This example might help too. Like when, let's say if I want to describe my experience of walking, okay? I walk from Wang Shimni to Dongdaemun. The typical, the easiest, the most basic that any English user can do is to do this, right? We as a participant, right? We as a participant doing the walking, which is the verb, and then you have other things in prepositional phrases as extra information, right? We walk from Wang Shimni to Dongdaemun, for example, right? That's the easiest typical pattern that we can interpret easily, we can process easily. But now there's another way of representing the same thing by turning the process into something else. We turn the process of walk into an agent. Our walk from Wang Shimni took us to Dongdaemun. It's like our walk is an agent right now, has become an agent that can take you, which in fact it cannot, because how could a walk could do something, right? It's just an abstract thing, right? So it took us to Dongdaemun. So this is a material process. So this is a kind of thing that we are practicing right now. So if you see this, our walk from Wang Shimni took us to Dongdaemun. If you want to kind of unpack the meaning, you have to look at who might be doing the walk, which is the more typical participant, we, right? We walk from Dongdaemun from Wang Shimni to Dongdaemun, for example, okay? I had an interesting question from one of us here. The point is non-congruent or incongruent sentence patterns are not wrong. They are not wrong, but they are harder to process. They are harder to understand, and they are correct, but they are correctly and they're correctly phrased, and they are grammatically correct. So, but they are hard to process. This is an example of a hard to process incongruent pattern. Cancer death rates are associated with increased smoking. Now, if we pay attention to increased smoking, now increased smoking is like, I don't know, an entity, right, associated with something, right, increased smoking. Now, my question is, what does increased smoking mean? Is it people smoke more? People smoke more than they used to? Or is it more people smoke? What does it mean, increased smoking? So when you shorten, when you condense a clause like more people smoke, or people smoke more into this kind of noun phrase, when you condense it, the meaning is so obscured, right? It's hard to understand, it's hard to process. Or cancer death rate, what does that mean? Does that mean the rate at which people die, like people die quickly, or the amount of people dying from cancer? So it could be interpreted like both ways. So when you change from the clause to a participant, to the subject, noun phrase participant, the meaning, a lot of meaning, is lost, right? In that kind of change from congruent to incongruent. So now we want to kind of unpack the meaning And that's in the exercise that we are looking at right now. Okay? Because people smoke more, there are more people dying. This one is easy to process, right? Or because more people smoke, whatever you want to say. The number of people who die increase like that. This is so easy to process, right? But if you use the incongruent pattern, I mean, the meaning is so obscure, so vague, right? So I think people who have problem with reading or processing information in English are people who have problem with the incongruent patterns. Okay? And incongruent patterns are, commonly found in writing, right? Like academic writing or serious writing, serious reading. So in number 3, for example, I hope that you're done with that one. In number 3, for example, American insistence on this exception invites other nations to craft their loopholes. To craft is to make, right? So we could do something like America, the US, insists on. So that's a clearer representation, right? Insists on this exception, right? So instead of saying American insistent, we can say America insists on, right? Or insisted on even, this exception. And this invites other nations and so on to craft their loopholes. So that's a more let's see. Oh. Sorry. I want to make it bigger, but everything is in Korean. Okay, so you can unpack American insistent into America insists on this exception and so on. Okay, so now you have the agent, you have the material, you have the verbal process and so on. Okay. In number 4, the president's silence is a surrender to military. The president becomes silent. You can say that, right? There are many ways to do that. Or the president became silent. And this is a surrender. But at least you can unpack, you can make it less complicated, right? By having the typical agent and by having the verb as a process, right? In number 5, disagreement over what the Bible says about gay sex has crafted rifts. Rifts are like different breaks. Created breaks in Protestant denominations for years. Denominations are like different sects of the same religion, right? So disagreement cannot create anything, right? So it must be people disagree or something. So you can say because people disagree over what the Bible says, like that. There have been rifts in Protestant denomination and so on. Okay? Because people disagree on what the Bible says. This is a more congruent representation, right? People disagree, like people as the agent, people as the participant, rather than disagreement as the participant. Right? Because the incongruent version is like the disagreement is the agent, which created rifts, and in fact it cannot. Right? In number 6, last one, again, same thing, the July 7 bombings prompted the British government to propose new anti-terrorism laws. So we have the July 7th bombing, right? In this case, it's not it's represented as an agent, but in fact it cannot be an agent, right? So you can find a subject for it, like who knows who bombed, like someone bombed the British government. Someone bombed. Someone maybe dropped a bomb, and this event prompted the government to propose new anti-terrorism law and so on. Okay? Or maybe a bomb was dropped if you don't want someone, right? That's why we use the passive voice, because we don't care about who did it, right? So after a bomb was dropped, the British government was prompted to propose and so on. So there are many ways to do that, but just choose one way, right? So we're talking about how to unpack the information in non-congruent, right, or incongruent patterns. Okay? So today we look at hard cases in transitivity analysis. We'll come back to do more hard cases on Monday, and we'll talk about nominalization, how you make clauses into nouns, and that might give rise to this kind of representation.